and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Please enjoy the story you will hear today.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to Our People podcast, where we share Holdeman Mennonite stories. Today, I'm joined by Dennis Goossen, and we're going to be discussing the life of John Holdeman. Dennis, do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit? And maybe tell them about your interest in history?
Yep. So I'm Dennis Goossen, originally born up in Canada and British Columbia, now living in Cimarron, Kansas. I'm a CPA by profession, and I've always had an interest in history, and that includes Holdeman history. So done a lot of writing and reading, and just enjoy talking about it.
Well, where do we want to start? Shall we lay the background a little bit? Kind of talk about the environment of the early 1800s?
Yeah, we definitely could. I noticed that was one of the things you had highlighted, was just what was the larger environment around which John Holdeman lived in and grew up in.
Yeah, so it's kind of I guess that first half of the 1800s is referred to as the Second Great Awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just kind of a renewed interest in religion here in the U.S. And there was a lot of revival meetings that were happening. So from what I understand, it was Methodist circuit riders that and Baptists as well, I believe,
mm-hmm.
would set up these tent meetings or out in the country or travel around and set up these revival meetings. And it was kind of like a big emotional event, these meetings.
Yeah, it was. I mean, just as far as the setting in which he grew up in, likely it would have been your general, like a frontier type situation. They were in Ohio there, growing up there. There was some of this is just speculation, but you're just assuming it's that standard kind of pioneer lifestyle with subsistence living, wood stoves, log houses, farm work, all that kind of stuff. There was this great awakening sort of sweeping through the land, and I noticed that in Hebert's book, he highlights there that there was a Weinebrenner, John Weinebrenner. He did found a congregation there right in Wayne County in 1833. So it came through the land. Some of what I'm looking at, though, when I was researching this, it was a little unclear as to how much this affected the Mennonites, because they were largely suspicious of the world around them and kind of tried to avoid that. And in fact, they did lose people to these revival efforts. And so they were even more kind of doubling down and like trying to avoid that whole movement.
Well, did I misread it? But wasn't the Weinebrenner Church of God congregation that was established there in Wayne County, wasn't it originally a Mennonite church?
You could that could well be true. John Funk was ordained as a minister there, which would be kind of a Mennonite name.
Yeah.
So
from what I understood, it was the church that John Holdeman would have grown up in was actually a kind of a split off, or they had decided to have their own services elsewhere from this Funk church. And then eventually this Funk church reorganizes into this Weinebrenner Church of God.
Yeah, and it appears that his conversion when he was 12 years old was under that preaching of that Church of God minister.
Yeah, that's interesting that they had split off and decided they were going to have more traditional services or something.
Mm-hmm.
But there was still quite a bit of coming and going back and forth there.
Yeah, attending each other's services and so forth.
Yeah. And then kind of around this part of this movement or this period in history, there's also a lot of interest in, I guess, restoring the first century church, or kind of this interest in primitive Christianity and trying to recreate that in that time period.
Yeah, there definitely was. It was just depending on which movement. I mean, there's lots of different movements that sprung up around that time, and some of them were looking for something new, some were looking for something primitive. It was just a real time of religious, like, just movement. A lot of religious movement, lots of different directions, a lot of fervor.
Yeah. And part of this also is kind of it looks to me like there's a revival of some of the, what would you call them, the gifts of the Spirit, or the charismatic gifts. There's sort of prophecy and healing, and let's see, what are all the gifts? Speaking in tongues. I don't know if that was really revived at that time, was it?
No, that I think would have been a different time period when the whole speaking in tongues thing came up. But yeah, certainly there was some of that. Yeah, when you sort of look through that time period, there's actually a lot of, like, some of the even quite far out restorationists and prophets popped up during that, like the Mormons, the Jehovah Witnesses, Christian Scientists. Like, that was all during that time period. There was a kind of a spiritualist movement out of New York that was popping up during that whole time. Among the, once again, there, I'm not clear as to how much of that was happening among the Mennonites, which, were still sort of trying to, well, there was kind of two schools of thought among the Mennonites of how, some of them were trying to draw back from it. Some of them were starting to embrace more progressive thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know either how much. I know that was one of the points of contention or whatever that John Holdeman drew away from the old Mennonite church, was that they were too involved with other churches.
Yeah.
So my sense is that it, for what John Holdeman claimed in terms of his prophecies and his restoration of the true church, for me, all of that seems just too much to be a coincidence. It seems like there's got to be a connection there somewhere.
Yeah, that's what I kept looking at. He never really refers to other movements in his writings, at least nothing that I could find. It's not like he was, saying that I'm emulating these people's style or these methods or anything like that. And he doesn't really correspond with anybody outside of the Anabaptist, it seems like. But it's right in that whole time period, which is very interesting.
Yeah. So let's get into, I guess, John Holdeman's childhood. He was born in 1832.
Mm-hmm.
And then he reports that he was converted at age 12. So he had some kind of a spiritual or religious experience, possibly, we don't know for sure, but possibly under the influence of this John Funk group.
Church of God minister.
And
something interesting about that is that he had his first vision right there at that same time. So he started off early with a vision when he was 12 years old at his conversion.
Yeah, and that's something that was important to him. He actually mentions it in The Mirror of Truth. I think he says something along the lines of that God, he had this vision of a bright light in the sky that was as bright as the sun. Yeah. And later, many years later, when he's writing The Mirror of Truth, he says that God has never shown anyone that vision. Do you remember what he says? Unless they're called to be a prophet or an apostle, something like that?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't remember that one. I'd have to look that up in The Mirror of Truth, but
yeah.
Yeah, so he took that as something unique, like he was called to something special.
Yeah. And actually, John Holdeman's father was the deacon. So in the Chester Mennonite Church was the name of that congregation. And from what I understand, John Holdeman's father, Amos, had actually been somewhat influential or a part of this split off or this founding of the Chester Mennonite Church?
Yeah, I think so. I didn't really look too much into that. But I think you're right. He was instrumental in there. In fact, you see that whole Holdeman family they were known to be influential. Like even the uncles, the extended family, they were, among the Mennonite world, they were relatively well educated. They were active in school boards and teaching, and then they were often active in church, either preaching, serving as deacons, serving on boards and things like that. So they were known to be speakers, teachers,
Yeah.
and often in the center of things.
Yeah, I'm just reading here. It looks like his grandfather Christian was appointed to serve as the school director. Amos had taught during the previous winter. Okay, so Amos was a teacher in their school there as well.
Which was common at that time, that they would appoint either a minister or a deacon to teach, because they could also, give religious instruction. I was just going to say, I don't think we know much about his life between the age of 12 and then, up to his 20s, whenever he got married. 2021, then when he got married, he was 20, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I assume that they were farmers and just trying to make a living, and I assume he would have just worked on the farm there. And
well, he does talk about, I know that he talks about in his journals that really his religious life, he didn't stay true to that conversion experience when he was 12. So, he confesses that himself, that he lived kind of a rough life in his upper teens. And, obviously the whole thing with him getting married and having a baby 5 months later, we all know that story.
Yeah, so his girlfriend, Elizabeth Ritter, is 4 months pregnant, and they get married. They don't get married in the church, which I don't know if that was common at the time or if that was uncommon, but they were married in the courthouse, from what I understand.
He wasn't baptized at that time. I think if you'll note that. So he had his conversion when he was 12, but he was baptized later in 1853. So that might have had an effect.
Yeah.
You're not a member of that church and then not getting married. So perhaps that's why that happened.
Right. Yeah, we should make note of that just for our listeners. It was kind of common, from what I understand at this point, where you would actually join the church later, late teens, early 20s. So that wasn't unusual necessarily for him in the sense that he joined as late as he did.
Right.
But so he gets married in November of 1852 at the age of 20. And then it's that next year in 1853 at the age of 21 where he starts to have his visions and no, I think the voice that spoke to him was later on. I think he just had visions and this feeling of calling to be a minister in the church.
Yeah.
So tell us about the dream that he had.
Yeah, well, this prophetic vision you're talking about, he dreamed of these pieces of glass that he was seeing. Is that the one you're referring to, the glass ice vision? Yeah, so he had these pieces of glass that he was seeing, and then taking them in his hands. Some of them were turning to ice, and then one of them started to melt in his hand.
Yeah, it's, to me that's very strange, because there's nothing about that dream that really, there's nothing overwhelming or powerful, or it just seems like a kind of a mundane dream, really. But for him, it was a very important dream, and he held on to that memory for years, for the rest of his life. And he also says that he had, I guess he doesn't really give details about it, but he had this feeling that he was called to be a minister.
Yeah, he had that feeling, which he shared with his bishop prior to him even being baptized. When he had an interview with his minister, his bishop, he shared that with them right away. He felt that.
Yeah, and the bishop didn't discourage him.
No, I mean, he said, maybe so. Maybe you're called to be a minister. Very possible.
So shortly thereafter, he's baptized. He's had these visions, or this dream, I should say, and he's had this feeling of calling to be a minister, and then he's baptized. And then pretty quickly there, he starts to really study the writings of Menno Simons and Dietrich Phillips.
Yeah, so
And
we should just mention that, or I would like to mention that anyways, that in his baptism, again, he had a big emotional experience, Holy Spirit overshadowing him like a cloud, special power and love like never before. So like definitely I'm seeing, when I'm just analyzing his I guess just his personality, he's, as a young person, he's obviously a very impressionable, imaginative, emotional, intense personality.
mhm. Yeah, and that was a part of this. That would have been a big part of what the Great Awakening was, wasn't it? Was these kind of emphasizing those big emotional experiences.
Yeah, definitely. That was a big thing of it, just bringing kind of like feeling your faith, being real enthused about it, reviving that enthusiasm. So that was definitely part of that.
So he starts to study the writings of the forefathers, and he comes to the conclusion fairly quickly that the church that he's just joined is he says that it's no longer on the true foundation, and that it's decayed, and that they're no longer following the practices of the, I guess, that Menno Simons would have laid out.
Yes. Yeah, so he went, he did go to a conference then in 1853, having just been baptized, stayed quiet, but then within the next few years, he began to really speak out.
Yeah, so a number of years go by, and then I guess he's becoming more and more uncomfortable with the situation that he's in. He has it's not a vision, but it's a voice that speaks to him. And I'm not sure if it's an audible voice or if it's kind of unclear to me whether or not it's an audible voice, but it's a voice that interprets this dream that he had had 4 years earlier, this dream of the ice melting in his hand.
Yeah, the ice melting. Now I can't quite, I'm having trouble finding my notes on that. But did that voice explain that was his calling to revive the church?
I don't think so. From what I remember, it just said the ice is your father. So it was,
yeah,
which was supposed to mean that, I guess, the ice melting represented somebody being converted under his preaching.
right.
And his dad was actually his first convert.
Yeah.
But he also reports that he heard it. This time it was an audible voice calling his name, and he heard that twice. And he says his wife heard it as well. So,
right, I remember that. Yeah.
And he said, if it calls the third time, then I'm going to answer like Samuel. But then it never calls the third time. So, so this is in January of 1858. So this is roughly 4 years after he becomes a member of the church and is baptized. And then he reports some more of these dream visions and voices, and he starts to preach at that point.
Yeah, so that was sort of a big thing. So 2 days after the ice vision, he that Sunday he felt like he needed to preach there from his home. He said he was under the powerful sway of the Holy Spirit. Preached, exhorted, affirmed. I think somewhere he's talked about preaching for a couple hours, and his 11 people were there, which included his father.
And I guess from what I understand, the main message there was just mostly about the church having been decayed and it needed to reform.
Yeah, and he affirmed his call to be a minister then too. So that was part of his message was, I'm called to be a minister. I'm called to reform the church.
Do you have he had 6 points where he thought the church had fallen from. Do you have that?
I don't have that in front of me. No, I know that the avoidance of the excommunicated was a big one in his mind. They were accepting unconverted people. They were baptizing unconverted people. They weren't training their children right, and they weren't keeping church pure. Those are the three that I can remember.
Yeah, and they were also not avoiding other churches.
Other churches as well, yeah.
And so he preaches this message in his home, and then a few days later, his dad comes to him, and Amos comes to him and says that he's been persuaded and that he thinks John is right and that the old Mennonite church is decayed.
Yeah.
So I don't have any notes between that time period in early 1858, but it appears that there was about a year there. Oh, he does go to the conference. I think you mentioned that, where he goes to the Old Mennonite Conference. But as I understand, they really didn't invite him to speak, so he just kind of sat there and he didn't say anything, and he regretted that later.
Yeah, I think he was maybe hoping that he would be invited to, share where he was going with this, and he really kind of took that as a rejection, or like it was shortly thereafter that then he like officially formed as a new congregation with a membership of 4 people.
Yeah, and so he starts having meetings in his own home, right? Or just in the
Yes.
homes of the. And it
Yeah,
was
mostly
himself.
in his home, but in homes of members.
Yeah, it was himself, his father, his uncle David, and do we know who the 4th person was? I haven't found it.
I don't know.
So that to me is interesting because,
Well, it would have been if he's saying a membership of 4, his wife was with him all along too, so he could be
okay.
referring to his wife.
Okay. So it's very much a Holdeman family,
Yeah.
kind of thing starting out.
Yeah,
And
in fact, that continued. Yeah, sorry, but yeah, I mean, probably for the next 20 years, that continued to just be a small group of mostly his family.
Yeah, his sister and her husband, Frank Seidner,
Frank
joined
Seidner, yeah.
Within a few years.
Mm-hmm.
In 1862, they joined, and then in 63, John Holdeman travels to visit the Amish in Fulton County, Ohio, and a man named Mark Seiler, who was a minister there in the Amish, joins the movement. And from what I understand, Mark Seiler and John Holdeman's brother-in-law, Frank Seidner, they were both ordained into the ministry. And from what I understand, they were pretty much kind of like his right-hand men, pretty influential in the early movement.
Yeah, well, and those are the only 3 ministers in that church for many, many years.
Right. And during this time period, he's doing quite a bit of traveling throughout the 1860s and really really all his life he traveled quite a bit, but throughout the 60s and 70s, he's really traveling and writing letters and trying to gain converts. And maybe this would be a good time to talk about the Egley Mennonites. It looks like in 1863, he met with Henry Egley for the first time to talk about a merger, possibly.
Yeah, so if you talk about mergers, actually, I'm not really clear on what the reasons were with the Egleys, but if you jump all the way back to I was going to mention this when we did this, but in 1858, towards the end of the year, John Holdeman and his father, they did go and talk to the Herite Mennonites and the Stauffer Mennonites. They were interested in joining up with either of those groups, but he specifically writes about the Herite Mennonites that he couldn't join with them because they had a different view on baptism than what he did, and so he was disappointed that there wasn't a potential for a merger there. And I think it's pretty strong in his mind that he was carrying the true church, and so they would have to take his baptism, and they didn't, they weren't willing to do that. So I don't know, maybe do you know more about the Egley Mennonites, what was going on with that?
I really don't. I know that it was a point of contention between Holdeman and Mark Seiler for really the rest of the time period that Seiler was involved with the Holdeman movement. from what I understand, Siler really wanted the Egley Mennonites to join, but he didn't feel like they needed to be rebaptized. He felt like they should join without being
Right.
rebaptized.
Yeah.
But of course, John Holdeman was against that. Should we maybe talk a little bit about, now that John Holdeman's kind of split away, he's formed his own movement. He's got this little bit of a following. He's got some ministers that are working under him to try to spread the movement as well. What was distinct about what he was doing?
Yeah, there were a few things that were interesting that I really highlighted. One is, we talked about the dreams and the visions and so forth. Now, that was happening among other people, other groups, but that really seemed to be pretty unique and odd among the other Mennonites. Like, he came under criticism from the old Mennonite church for his reliance and his like all these visions and dreams. They called him a young rebel. They kind of criticized these special revelations. The other Mennonite churches, or Mennonites in general, tend to emphasize like a communal discernment of scripture. And in contrast, he would get most of his wisdom from his revelations. He would have this dream or this revelation that he was called to reform the church, and then he would do that. And if he could bring people to his cause, that was great, but that was really what he was using as his guiding light. So that was definitely unique in his in his movement. The other things that I was just looking at, you were kind of talking about what was unique. So there's a really good book that I could share with you, and I could check with the author if he's interested in having that being shared out, but highlighting a lot of differences between Menno Simons and John Holdeman in their teachings. So the two primary issues, I guess there's three actually, I forgot to jot this other one down, but first of all was just the whole church issue. So John Holdeman is really interested and focused on maintaining a true lineage of church, and that was important to that lineage would not be broken, that any Christian would bring himself into that lineage so that you're part of this true family of God. Now, Menno Simons also does seem to talk about a true church, and he refers to true church a lot in his writings. But his vision of a true church was anywhere that the true doctrine was taught was the true church. And, a way of proving that or portraying that was that so he was in the Swiss or in the German Mennonites, and then he excommunicated all of the Swiss Mennonites because they disagreed with him about the ban, which tells us that prior to that he viewed them as brethren, even though they weren't in the same lineage as him. They came up from the Radical Reformation there in Switzerland. And also Menno Simons very strongly disputed the idea of lineage, because his own lineage, being baptized into the Anabaptists, went back to Melchior Hoffman and that whole debacle there in Munster. So that was his lineage. So he disputed that we would be able to rely on a lineage to claim a true church status. I guess the other thing was church discipline. Both John Holdeman and Menno Simons they did teach a pretty strong church discipline, excommunication of anyone that's sinning and refusing to repent. The difference, I think, was the focus of why the church would excommunicate. So Menno Simons would always talk about, we're doing this to restore a sinner back to the fold, back to Christ, to warn him of his ways and so forth. John Holdeman, because of his focus on purity and this keeping the church pure and keeping the lineage pure, the reason for excommunication was to keep that church pure. And you can definitely see that in Holdeman's focus other times too. So there's a real hesitancy or like a caution on baptizing people, bringing them into the church. until we're 100% sure that they are converted, that they're Christians, that they're living right, because
Right.
it's important that anything that comes into the church is pure. So Menno, he focused more on restoration and so forth. The other thing is the avoidance of the excommunicated. Now Menno Simons was pretty strict on that, but you do see evidence of him repenting, backing off, softening in his older years, where Holdeman kept a really strict view on avoidance, even a lot stricter than what most Holdemans would keep today. The
Yeah.
third
Go ahead.
and the third thing was just the view on revelations, like revealing things from dreams and the spirit and so forth, where Menno Simons very clearly in his writings, he says, I don't desire any kind of visions or dreams. He says the word alone is good enough for me. And obviously John Holdeman had a real propensity and a real reliance on revelation. Not even something that he would, it wasn't something that he tried to skate his way around. That was his claimed authority. He had authority because of the visions, because of the dreams.
Yeah, so the Holdeman movement is, to me, it looks like it's this kind of a weird mix of strict theological, the strict theological emphasis on one hand, but then it's also this more spiritual, emotional movement on the other hand.
Yeah, and I don't know if you wanted to get into the Russian Mennonites or the Ostrogers and the Kleingemeinde, because that's really what drew these two very different groups into the Holdeman Church, where the Holdeman Church really took off. And it was sort of that blend, kind of an unusual blend of like this austere, strict lifestyle, religious lifestyle, and this spiritualist, mystical view of spiritual life. So you don't find those two together very often, and the Holdeman Church does seem like it has that blend, which was uniquely attractive to these two groups.
Yeah, I think we should get into that, but one more thing, this issue of revival meetings, this was also kind of an innovation. John Holdeman was having revival meetings, which he took from these Methodists, right? Probably from the circuit riders, or just where did that revival meetings come from?
Well,
that's a big part of the Great Awakening, right?
There's some suggestion in history that the Ostrogers had an annual revival system of getting together annually for cleaning house and having communion. So
Okay.
I don't know if there was something coming from that as well. The whole kind of revivalism, I think, does come from this, the Great Awakening thing. But the Holdeman view of the annual revival seems like it's once again a blend of this kind of this spiritual revival that was happening in America, combined with this really strict and austere view of getting into your life and reviewing your life and seeing, what kind of flaws and failures and attitudes and sins that I have in my life, and cleaning that up so I can, be ready for a communion and going up to the next year. So it's kind of like, once again, it's this hybrid system.
Yeah, so let's dive into the Russian Mennonites.
Sure.
There's actually not a lot of history in between. I mean, there is, but there's not a lot to talk about in between the John Holdeman's breakaway from the old Mennonite church.
I think you would just, the thing to maybe highlight is that the membership of the Church of God in Christ Mennonite really stagnated for quite a long time. I don't know if stagnated is the right term. It just grew very, very slowly. Like it was, obviously it started with 4 members in 1859. By just kind of skimming through here, by 1865, so 6 years later, we had 20 members. And then if you kind of jump down, a little bit later, 1875, you had 61 members. So it was kind of sitting in that, but it never really even broached 100 members until, where was it now here? 1879, he started corresponding with Peter Taves. Actually, sorry, 1877, he started, right? Even earlier. I'm just poking through here. But yeah, so no, 1876 is the first letter he sees to Peter Taves up in Canada. And then I'm trying to just skim through here to see 1874 is when his uncle David Holdeman started working with the Ostrogers in Kansas.
Let's back up a little bit.
Sure.
What's the difference between what we call, when we were in the church, there was the Pulse and the Melush.
Yeah.
Clarence Heber in his book calls them the Ostrogers and the Clannagamindi.
Yeah.
Maybe let's just do a quick outline of the differences between those groups and who they were.
Yeah, definitely. So there's three main groups of background, or like the Anabaptist heritage, the Mennonite heritage people in the Holdeman Church. So first of all, there's the Swiss Mennonites. That's John Holdeman's people, and like the Amish would come under that as well. So you see some of those coming into the church. That was sort of the first 60, 70 members in the Holdeman Church were that. Then you have the Ostrogers, who were that's sort of your central Kansas people. So they moved to the U.S., very poor, very destitute. They were also quite an austere, strict group of people. And then you have the Kleingemeinde. Kleingemeinde is German or Low German for small church. And they were up in Canada, and they were well, there's some differences there, but that's sort of your three branches. And yeah, the primary evolution of the Holdeman Church after that time period, when those two groups joined the Holdeman Church, was really shaped by those two groups and their views, their interactions, and so forth. So there's some history if you go back in Mennonite history as to where these two groups came from. And I'm not as familiar with the Ostrogers. In fact, it's a little more fuzzy with them, but they were the Ostrogers they kept themselves separate from the other Mennonites already back in the old country, because they were trying to remain, well, they felt like the other Mennonites were too loose, too lax with their spiritual disciplines, with their life. And as a result, they were sort of isolated. And then they were very poor, very they were in really rough circumstances in Poland. When they emigrated finally to the USA and ended up in Kansas, which is a whole saga all of its own, very interesting story. But the other Mennonites in Kansas really tried to help them, but they ended up kind of rejecting a lot of that help, using some of it a little bit, but they felt very like they didn't want to join these other Mennonites in Kansas because they were too progressive, they were too modern, and so forth. But also, these other Mennonites were well established in Kansas already, and the Ostrogers felt like they were these poor, uneducated people. When John Holdeman came on the scene through his uncle David, who had some contacts there seemed like there was a kindred spirit there. John Holdeman was really austere in his religious views. He was trying to hold himself separate from the other Mennonites because they were too progressive. He was being rejected by the other Mennonites. And the Ostrogers they didn't have any strong leadership at that point. Their one leader, Tobias Unruh, seemed like he was going a different direction. He was actually establishing something up in Nebraska. And so the Ostrogers really had they were leaderless too. And so John Holdeman, he was charismatic and strong and had strong leadership and so forth. I actually had a quote here that comes from an article there. Let me see if I can find it.
Yeah, when the Ostrogers came, they really, really struggled. They actually had a large number passed away that first winter.
Yeah.
Because they arrived in Kansas in the middle of winter, and they had no homes to go to. They were put up in an old warehouse.
Yeah.
And so a large number of them got sick and passed away. And so they really, those first few years, they were really struggling here in the U.S.
Yeah, so here's that quote. It's just written by one of the, actually another Mennonite who was just kind of doing an analysis of this late after the fact. And here, what he said is, although Holdeman was not a powerful preacher, he had the gift of influence in persuading the uneducated. So he had sort of this, he swept in and just gave leadership to this group that didn't have a leader. He gave acceptance to this group that wasn't accepted. And, the doctrinal similarities were there. The idea of living really strict, really austere was there. So they really took off with that. Now the Kleine Gemeinde, if we're ready to switch gears to the Kleine Gemeinde, they were a different story. And I've really wrestled with that over the years, trying to figure out what was attractive with the Kleine Gemeinde. But once again, they have a history as well. And really their history, so they were in the Molochna colony in Ukraine, in Russia back then, which had ended up being a fairly wealthy colony. The Mennonites were doing really well there. But the Kleine Gemeinde this group saw the larger Mennonite colony as becoming too worldly, too lax, all of these things. And so they broke away from the main larger Mennonite church, hence they're called the small church, Kleine Gemeinde. They broke away from that. And so there's again this idea of keeping the church true, keeping the church pure, trying to be more conservative, trying to hold more of a form, hold more of a lifestyle than what the larger Mennonite church is doing. They ended up coming to Canada, to Manitoba, but because of their background there in the Molochna colony, they came with money. They were pretty wealthy. They were pretty educated. They were pretty sophisticated. They didn't have this problem about being rejected by society. They were well respected by society. In fact, you can see that even through probably the next 100 years in Manitoba, where there were formerly Kleine Gemeinde and now Holdeman men that were serving as mayors of towns, as chairmen of school boards, as they were working together with the government on conscientious objector things. They were doing a lot of stuff.
They were a bit more involved in the outside.
They were certainly were. They were more open-minded to being involved with the outside. But the connection really, I think, it really circles a lot around the one man, Peter Taves, who was the elder leader of the Kleine Gemeinde in Manitoba. There was another group in Nebraska as well. So the Kleine Gemeinde kind of split, and half of them went to Nebraska and half went to Manitoba. And Peter Taves, it seems to me like when he was looking at that, the thing that he missed was the mysticism and the spiritualism. So they broke away from the larger Mennonite church. They were trying to live this, more of a form of hold on. Okay, so they were trying to live this form, this austere life, because the old, the larger Mennonite church was really drifting away into what they viewed as worldly life. But they didn't have the whole it ended up being a form of living, kind of a shallow, just keeping the rules. And so what Peter Taves really saw with John Holdeman then was once again this blend. He had the spiritual side of things. He had the mystical side, the dreams and revelations and so on and so forth. Although I don't think I ever saw any evidence of Peter Taves experiencing the same. He certainly was a man that would be inclined that way. He was a poet, he was a songwriter, he was somewhat of a musician or a singer. So more like kind of a sensitive, creative type person who really wanted that for his church. So they went back and forth, and finally Peter Taves agreed that they would be baptized into the Holdeman church, which really decimated the Kleine Gemeinde church. Took them years, decades to recover.
Well, I'm trying to find it here. Wasn't there some dispute at some point in time between the Clan of Gemeinde and maybe the group that they split away from over assurance of salvation, where they were teaching some. It's the part of the Holdeman people I didn't read, so I'm trying to find it here. But from what I remember,
keep going.
you,
I just read that, and I'm trying to remember where I read it.
yeah,
Yes.
I was trying to find it here too.
So John Holdeman taught, yes, you could have an assurance of salvation. Peter Taves accepted that. The other leader, kind of the sub leader, the second in command in Canada of the Kleine Gemeinde, didn't want to accept the assurance of salvation piece. And so that's why his about a third or a quarter of the Kleine Gemeinde stayed with Kleine Gemeinde.
Okay.
With him, and then the other 2/3 went with Peter Taves. I think that is that what you read?
You know, I just glanced at it a couple of days ago,
Yeah.
and I was going to go back and reread it.
Yeah. So John Holdeman would often teach, like, if you have this experience, you have this experience of assurance, and then you have assurance. And really, at that point, the Kleine Gemeinde were more like, here's what we see in the Bible. You have to live according to these ways, then you'll probably be saved.
Yeah.
And that's what Peter Taves is really struggling with. So, I mean, you can get into later church history somewhat, and that might be time for a different time, but that really set up decades of disputes or just kind of minor issues between these two groups. With the Kleine Gemeinde, the Canadian Brethren, being a little more open-minded, a little more well-to-do, a little more free to work with the people around them. The Ostrogers and the American Holdemans being a little more austere, a little stricter, a little more isolationist. And then those two would often they would butt heads, and they would disagree with each other.
Would you say that's largely gone away at this point in time in history, or do you think there's still?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I can even point to instances in history where those roles almost seem to reverse a few times, where all of a sudden the Canadian Brethren were the ones that were really strict on something.
Yeah.
Like during the panel times in the 1970s. So so it kind of went a couple different directions, and I think by now there's been enough intermarriage and intertraveling that those lines have really kind of blurred.
Mm-hmm.
But I know even when I was younger, so that's 35, 40 years ago, I'd still hear the older ones kind of commenting when there was a marriage between an American and a Canadian that, oh, cultural differences, not sure if this is going to work. And nowadays people aren't really worried about that anymore.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if nowadays people would even, if you mention the Pulse and the Malash, if they would even really know what that was unless they've had some.
Yeah, when I was young, that was a standing joke about some of those differences.
Yeah. Okay, so these Russian Mennonites, these two groups, they kind of they join up with Holdeman's movement, and the number of members goes from somewhere around 100 to somewhere between 700 and 750 just almost overnight within a number
it really
of years.
shot up. Yeah.
How much more time do you have? Do you want to?
Well, you know what? If you've got the time, let's keep going, because whatever we have left, it's going to be awkward to squeeze it into it's going to be too short for another episode. So let's just keep going. If you have the time.
Yeah, where do we want to go from here?
Well, the two main things that you had, or I was going to talk about, I guess, some of John Holdeman's later life, but then we also wanted to talk about the conferences that were held before the official conference in 1896. So those are the sort of the two different strands. Maybe we should just finish talking about Holdeman's life, and then go into these conferences. Does that sound good?
Yeah, trying to find my place here in the.
Sure. Well, there was a couple of things that I sort of highlighted here about his life. So after this really took off, in some senses, John Holdeman's role started to decline.
Right.
So he was facing significant financial issues, and that's that's kind of a whole saga, but it really stemmed, I would say, because really his focus was on his ministry. He traveled a lot. He told Peter Taves that for the past 13 years he'd been away more than he'd been at home. So he didn't really, they were trying to farm. There was times where he mentioned that, he had left his sons at home to harvest. He couldn't get home in time to help with the harvest. He had this idea, from his visions and his dreams, that his church was really going to take off and people would flock to his leadership. And so he would write these books and print lots and lots of books, which really ended up costing him a lot of money. So he did that. He made some bad investment decisions, and yeah, really that was really, I would say, the last half of his life, that kind of was uppermost in his mind. He really was very concerned, very depressed. At one time, he told the rest of the church they should just go ahead and excommunicate him because he had these debts. But at the same time, he actually took donations from his church to help pay his debts. And really died with hardly any money to his name in the end, which, that's too bad to think about that. So there was that. Interestingly, if we, cross bridges over to these conferences that we talk about, one of the things that they really talk about was requiring members of the church to ask for permission before they would take on debts, because the assumption was that the church would have to pay the debt if that person wouldn't be able to pay his debt. So they were thinking themselves as a community, and so if we're going to have to pay your debts, then you better ask for permission from us before you take on these debts.
So there's 7 conferences that happened prior to 1896, but the church currently does not publish the records of those conferences.
Correct.
It looks like to me a lot of the things they're discussing is the avoidance seems to be one topic they discuss a lot in these conferences, and how we should avoid people and who we should avoid. Also this issue of rebaptizing. Who are we going to rebaptize? Who are we going to let join without rebaptism?
So it's 7 conferences from 1868 to 1887. So 7 conferences in the space of about 19 years. I'm not sure why they're not published. It's not really like it's kept a secret. It's there in the archives and everything. It's just not really talked about. I think, just my kind of non-cynical view of this, is that these aren't official minutes. They're Holdeman's personal notes. And so it's not, an official church thing. I'm wondering about that. And also, I don't think that these conferences were nearly quite as formal. Like the first conference, I think, was just the 20 members that were there in Wayne County, Ohio, talking about things. But yeah, there's some very interesting stuff. I mean, if these were referred to as conferences, some of the rules that are in here would they would contradict things that are in the current conference book, which is interesting. But
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, they talk about the calling of the ministers. They talk a lot about avoidance, how strong to make the avoidance, whether we can accept baptisms, who can baptize, when do we withdraw a holy kiss, when do we start the avoidance, when do we stop the avoidance? Lots of those kinds of things.
And like you mentioned, their perspective on the avoidance was actually more strict than what's currently practiced. So I would imagine if they're published, that could cause some. There would be a.
They would have to deal with that one way or the other. Either overturn those or explain them away or something down that line.
And then one of them. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say something interesting that I just found in Hebert's book was that because they were living with their son Alpha Holdeman, who was excommunicated, and so Holdeman would refuse to eat at his table, but his wife Elizabeth wouldn't wouldn't
Right.
avoid. She did eat at the table with Alpha, meaning that she wasn't eating it with John at the table. So even within their own home, there was some difference there of how this should be kept.
Yeah. And one of them, from what I understand, the only thing that they discussed was this lawsuit that
Yeah.
Joseph Lichty, I believe was his name. Joseph was suing, was it Holdeman and Seiler and Seidner? Anyway, he was suing some of the top leadership
Yes.
because he had been excommunicated, and his wife wouldn't eat with him, and that was kind of a really a sore subject for John Holdeman for a long time. Actually, he included his account of that whole event and all of the legal processes. He had an account of that he included in the back of the Mirror of Truth
Mm-hmm.
for a number of years, until I think eventually some of the other leadership persuaded him to tear those out, to tear that part of the book out.
That's interesting. Yeah, in a sense, that whole thing, I mean, just coming from a Mennonite background, like all those people did, that wasn't something that dissuaded them from holding the avoidance. That was more like, well, this is the persecution that we've always expected to suffer from, and they viewed it as that as a persecution from an ungodly man.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, another, I mean, this is just sort of an interesting one on my mind, but there was this very strict, like it's very common among Holdeman Mennonites, and actually a lot of people, you don't swear, if you're in a court of law, you affirm. Right. Instead of swearing at a court of law. But in 1879, their conference said that, no, we're not even going to affirm, because basically affirming is just taking the place of swearing. And so we can't affirm either. So, that's an interesting one that's in there.
Yeah, and it looks like Holdeman had a different view on divorce and remarriage than what the church currently practices. Is that right?
Yeah, that could well be. I don't know if I haven't studied that.
Because he, at various points, he says that divorce is allowed in the case of adultery.
Yeah.
Which, in my experience, that isn't practiced.
Yeah, I think you're right. He did have that view, and I think that is still technically the Holdeman Church's view, that divorce is allowed, but like you said, it's not very commonly practiced, which that would be another thing that would hold them apart from a lot of the at least more conservative Mennonite churches, where they would they would for sure not allow a remarriage after a divorce.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple of other interesting things in here that I'm kind of going through. Tobacco was an interesting issue. And actually, when I'm reading about Peter Taves, that almost stopped their merger, or their joining the Holdeman Church, when they went down to Kansas and he observed brothers using tobacco. And they sort of explained it away that, well, they were using it as medicine. And the reason was because if I stop using it, I feel sick. So So there was some key people in Kansas using tobacco, that was there, but it's specifically allowed for medicinal purposes. That's the on paper, the decision on tobacco. And finally, Peter Taves, I think, agreed to kind of overlook that.
Yeah, and there was also a thing where the Clannigamindi head covering had fringes on it. Is that right?
Yes. So if I have this right, the Clannigamindi was a black covering with fringes, and the Holdeman was a white covering without fringes. And Holdeman and Taves negotiated for quite a long time and concluded to settle with black, no fringes.
Yeah, if you take the fringes off, then I'll accept it, I think.
Yeah. But then they all had to go to black, though.
Oh,
because
really?
it was important that it would all be the same. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed like there was still some kind of reverberating issues about John Holdeman never being formally ordained. That came up a couple times because he never, he was never ordained in the old church. Finally, it looks like that never really got put to rest, except that they just said, well, we don't doubt that you're called to be a minister. So whether you were technically ordained or not, we're not going to worry about that.
Yeah, they have a person can be called directly by God, or a person can be called through the congregation, and that still remains their official perspective. But John Holdeman's the only one that's been called
Other than,
directly.
yeah, him and Apostle Paul
Right.
are the two that were called directly by God.
And Holdeman does compare himself to Paul.
Yeah.
At least once, I know, when he talks about his vision of the light in the sky, he says that Paul had a similar vision.
Paul had the similar thing, the blinding light. Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to highlight in those conferences too was it seemed like there was a continual, and I don't know who it's coming from, but there's still discussion about inviting other churches to come.
Right.
Yeah.
We mentioned it, but then we didn't close that loop. This Mark Seiler, that was the Amish convert, he really wanted these Egley Mennonites to join without rebaptism. And that was a contention between him and John Holdeman. But then there was also this issue of something called Swedenborgianism, which that's the first time I've heard of it was in reading this history. But Seiler started following this writer named Swedenborg, and Holdeman viewed that as heresy, or outside of the doctrinal norms that he was holding on to. So eventually this Seiler was excommunicated, and I believe he joined the Egley Mennonites. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that happened. Either was it Seiler or Frank Seidner. In the end, they both ended up leaving Holdeman some 20 years after they joined, and one of them or both of them went with the Swedenborgs, and then might have ended up in the Egley Mennonites. So yeah, that was, I think it continued to be a contentious thing, because probably more from the other people that joined Holdeman's church. So they kept bringing this up that, well, there's all these other Christians, and can we work together with them? But then if you would really look technically into Holdeman's position about this lineage thing, well, no, we can't work with them unless they would come under our baptism. So that kept always being the sticker. Like the question, I think, in the 1887 conference was, we call this a conference of the Church of God, but how can we, we probably should be inviting all of the Church of God, or all of the believers, to come conference with us, if we want to call this a conference of the Church of God. And that was sort of the thing. And I think what I was left at was, well, yeah, we're inviting all churches to come join with us. We're never saying that they can't come and join us, but they would have to join us under our baptism.
Right. That was a pretty important thing for Holdeman. And it was also something that he felt like his views on that were misrepresented by a lot of the people that would write articles about him in the papers, because he always did hold that there was salvation for people outside of his group, as long as they, as long as they weren't aware that he was doing what he was doing.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that he ever really drew that hard, fast line, but it was more like, anybody outside of my group, you might, you're probably saved, or you might be saved, but that's God's business. We'll leave that with you. This is our church. This is the true church, and we know it. We know that we're the true church. You're doing your own thing. Yeah. There's not a whole lot. I wasn't able to collect a whole lot of information, but he continued to prophesy. Focus on prophesied dreams. The only prophecies that I really have, the one big one that really caused him the most distress was the prophecy that his mother would join his church, at which she never did. And then he fell under accusation about that, because he calls himself a prophet, but then this one prediction doesn't come true. And his defense was, I've had hundreds of predictions come true.
Okay.
Now that may be true. Of course, the scripture says if you call yourself a prophet and one thing falls, you're a false prophet. But this was his defense, and I think really the whole Pentecostal movement that would kind of fall down that same line of they don't expect all of their prophecies to come true anymore because they've been false too many times.
Yeah, how do we understand John Holdeman as a prophet? Because this was something that I was never taught, and I feel like it's probably something the majority of members in the church aren't aware of, that he was this prophet, or he had these visions of the future, and then he would prophesy, and sometimes they would come true, and then sometimes they had to, after the events, they had to kind of go back and reinterpret what he meant.
Yeah, I would definitely say that part of his life or that part of his beliefs weren't promoted, weren't talked about because they were a little too troublesome. And really the idea that anybody else, I mean, as far back as I can remember or listening to my parents and grandparents talk, there never was any suggestion that anyone, like I've never heard of prophecy being practiced in the church, so that seems like a thing. Now you can read about some of the early ones, like I can read about Frank Wenger, not Frank, FC Fricky. He prophesied, he had dreams, but it seems like it really fell out of use with, I mean, that seemed like something that Holdeman is really quite unique at, is this claiming this ability to be a prophet.
Well, and that would make sense if you also have this teaching that revelation or inspiration is a communal thing where everybody gets together and agrees. And you can't really have this other person over here prophesying and not agreeing with everyone else.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, Holdeman did, I mean, he considered himself to be unique, not necessarily 100% unique in history, but he had a unique calling to reestablish the church. So, maybe the theory was that maybe, sometime in the future, there'd be another unique calling, and this person would again be a prophet. But
yeah,
he certainly prophesied, and I think that might still technically be in the books, that when these laying hands on a minister to ordain them and to have that ordination prayer on a minister was supposed to have a prophetic effect. Like you're supposed to prophesy what this person's goals and or what his gifts and where his calling would be. And and Holdeman himself kept notes of most of his prophecies, and he would prophesy that this one was for reaching the unsaved, this one would be was to keep the church pure, and this he would prophesy different gifts on people.
Yeah, and you mentioned a little bit how that John Holdeman's leadership role changed, and that was something. Was it at the 1896 conference, or was it the one prior, where after Seidner and Seiler had both left the movement, he actually, or somebody, reads these prophetic prayers at this conference, and they're sort of trying to prove whether or not it was prophesied in these prayers that Seiler and Seidner would leave the movement eventually.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and I think that might have been one of these last unpublished conferences, because the 1896 conference, and there's a bit of a jump there because that's 9 years. So the 1887 conference, there's not, like, Holdeman didn't write very many notes, but there definitely was a focus on Holdeman, and because John Holdeman was not ordained officially in the old church, and what do we do about that? And so he was sort of in the spotlight.
Yeah.
And then you kind of circle around to the 1896 conference. Holdeman chaired that conference, and it was really, in my view, was pivotal in the history of the Holdeman Church, because they really established like doctrinal statements, and it's kind of like almost like a fresh start. That's
Right.
what I would view the 1896. So they had they put down a bunch of doctrinal statements. They really got really very systematic with a bunch of things they were doing. Whereas prior to that, it was like dealing with things that were popping up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I'm not sure. It could be the 1896 conference. I don't have proof of that, but that's my inclination to think about.
Yeah, that's interesting that even within his lifetime, there was, at least they had some questions about um, some of the things he was doing with his
Yeah.
prophecies or his calling. Um, but they actually invited him. So was it 4 years before he passed away? He moved to central Kansas, and if
Yes.
I remember right, they actually invited him to be the leader of that congregation. There was it Lone Tree.
Yeah, they asked him to, or they offered that he could take the leadership of the congregation, and he declined because he felt like his responsibility was for the church at large. Although really at that point he was starting to ail enough that he didn't really travel a whole lot after that anyways.
But yeah, he still very much was respected and considered to be it was his movement, and he was the
Yeah.
he was the he was still very important to the movement. Yeah, and then I guess how does that happen with his debts then? So does the church end up covering most of them?
Well, that is not 100% clear. I know that even in those last few years, he was writing around a lot for asking for help to help pay off his debts. And then in his will, he talked about debts again and asked, saying basically like if people want if his family wants his clothing or his books or his writing materials, that they should first pay that amount to the estate to help pay off his debts. So I don't know if those ever really got paid. We don't have record of that. At least I don't have record of that. But I guess, legally speaking, they're not the responsibility of the church. So it may be that those debts were simply extinguished when he died.
Yeah. I think wasn't his farm going to be foreclosed on?
I think so. Yeah, he was working on it. That was
in Missouri. He was living in Missouri at the time.
That was the Missouri farm.
And then the church gives him, or maybe do they give it to him, or is he expected to pay for it? I think he is expected to pay for it. These 40 acres.
He was the foreclosure was threatened in 1895. And then and that was kind of roughly 1897. He moves to, I think he sold that farm in Missouri, got rid of it, maybe got some of that debt, and then in 1897 he moves to Lone Tree. So Lone Tree basically just gave him the use of this little house and land, and then he spent those last 3 years just on that piece of land. But obviously he still did have debt, because in 1898 he was still writing letters asking for help with his debt.
Yeah. And then he passes away at the age of 68 in let's see, March 10 of the year 1900, at the age of 68. And there's a lot more history we could cover after that, but I don't know where do we want to go from here. What can we learn from John Holdeman?
Well, so to his credit, I want to give credit to his religious fervor. He was enthused about working for what he felt was right, and I want to give him credit for that. And like the things like reaching out to people around the world, definitely that. I think what I see as failures or mistakes was the kind of the lone wolf mentality that he had of going off and just doing what he felt like he was called to do without really looking to the community around him to help guide him. He, like his church there, he was this 20-year-old young man, got baptized, and then within 4 years he was off doing his own thing. And really in the span of a human lifetime, to just be in a church for 4 years and then say, well, no, this is not working, I'm going to start my own church instead. I think we would all view that as pretty rash and pretty impatient.
Yeah, and I think that's something that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, is just how young he actually was. He was only 27 when he started his movement.
That's right. Yeah. So pretty young man, and kind of took off with that without a lot of community support. So yeah, it's interesting, when you look at where his church ended up, and in a way it was just a couple, I would call them accidents of history. Maybe it was fate or divine provision, I don't know, but the fact that he was able to link up with the Ostrogers and the Kleingemeinde, that's really the saving grace of his church. And then having, I mean, you could get into that in a different episode, but after his death, the church floundered again. It was in that 750 members at that point. And it took a few years, and then FC Fricke there from Michigan took up the mantle and really kind of guided the church after that. So once again, it was another unique individual that ended up kind of saving the Holdeman Church's fate.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to end. A good teaser for the next episode was, who was FC Fricke and what did he do to guide the new movement into well, not so much a new movement, but to guide it into the 1900s, 20th century.
Yep, absolutely. It'd be another interesting thing.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed this. I think we covered a lot of ground, and we covered a lot of the important stuff. And I think there was, hopefully our listeners learned some things they didn't know before.
Nice talking to you.
Yes, sir. All righty. Let's do it again sometime.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.